Hello, my friends. Have a nice day. For years, Western media has repeated the same comforting mantra. Russia is collapsing, NATO is dominant, and victory is only a matter of time. But far away from studio lights and government press briefings, the battlefield tells a very different story. The numbers, the destroyed brigades, the empty arms warehouses, the panicked rush for ammunition, none of it matches the triumphant narratives coming out of Brussels or Washington. Quietly, beneath the surface, a harsh truth has been forming. Europe is exhausted. NATO is overstretched, and the West is fighting a war it neither understands nor can win. This isn't speculation. It's not propaganda. It's the blunt assessment that anyone with real operational experience can see unfolding in real time. And because too many leaders refuse to say it out loud, I will. Now, let's speak plainly, without illusions, without wishful thinking about the state of Western military power today. I have news for the Europeans. You've lost the arms race by knockout. You're not just one generation behind Russia in weapons and doctrine. You're two generations behind. Two, you don't have the resources. You don't have the industrial capacity. And the only thing you can cling to now are the few areas where there's still some residual competence left. Aerospace projects like Airbus, for example, you still have some expertise, some institutional memory there. But beyond that, militarily, industrially, strategically, you're hollowed out. Even people from the Western system are starting to admit it, sometimes by accident. Take Ben Hodges, a career logistics officer, former commander of U.S. Army Europe. Even he has finally conceded that NATO, logistically, simply cannot perform what its public rhetoric promises. That's not a small admission. There is a whole directorate in the Russian General Staff dedicated purely to studying NATO logistics in Europe. They know exactly what NATO can and cannot do. And what they see is an alliance that was built in the 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds for a defensive posture on short preposition lines, not a long-range offensive war against Russia, along endless lines of communication. Back then, you had the British Army of the Rhine, the Bundeswehr deployed in depth, everyone basically fighting where they were stationed, with the US and UK also functioning as occupation forces. The system was built under a completely different technological and operational paradigm. Pre-positioned equipment, short distances, predictable routes. That world no longer exists. Today, war is fought under the conditions of long-range precision fires, 24/7 ISR, drones, satellite reconnaissance, electronic warfare. How exactly does NATO plan to fight Russia and Ukraine under those conditions? How do they intend to deploy meaningful combat power and sustain it for even the first 2 weeks of a high-intensity fight without going nuclear and being annihilated in the process? They do not have the means, and this is not only about Europe. You can mock European politicians all day. They've earned it. And you can criticize Kiev's suicidal arrogance, which I will in a moment. But the United States has to be added into that picture. Whatever Marco Rubio says, whatever Trump's team claims, a lot of it is completely disconnected from reality on the ground. Underneath the bombast, you see the same rot: deindustrialization, doctrinal stagnation, and political fantasies. Look at Rubio's own accidental moment of honesty. Just a week ago, he admitted, and I'm paraphrasing, that it doesn't really matter what weapons the U.S. sends to Ukraine. As soon as they are deployed near the front, they're detected and destroyed. That's coming from a U.S. senator who is usually a reliable mouthpiece for the most hawkish nonsense. When a guy like that blurts out something that actually reflects the real operational picture, you should pay attention. So, yes, the United States is the main driving force behind this conflict, but the situation is now diverging from the wishful thinking of Washington and Brussels. Even Trump, a man with no deep principles besides self-promotion, has started to sense that the U.S. has to extricate itself from this war if it wants to remain a great power. If you want to retain global influence, you have to cut your losses, rebuild domestic capacity, and stop bleeding out industrially and militarily in a war you cannot win. Europe, on the other hand, is being set up as the sacrificial lamb. Europe will be eaten economically, strategically, and even demographically Russia is already in the process of neutralizing Europe militarily. The Chinese have their own plans for Europe economically and politically. And in the middle, you have European elites who seem utterly unaware they're being used up and discarded. The United States itself cannot fight this war in any meaningful conventional sense. It has been thoroughly demilitarized for a large-scale peer conflict. Yes, there are still some frontline units, for example, elements of the 4th Infantry Division, certain armored brigades, that retain some combat power. But if Washington starts feeding those remnants into Ukraine, that's all they've got. They will be annihilated by Russia's integrated fires and ISR, and then the U.S. will be naked. The U.S. Air Force has no viable way to operate over a modern Russian air defense and electronic warfare environment without catastrophic losses. So what's left? Escalation toward World War III, a nuclear exchange. That's the path the Biden-Harris crowd was blindly inching toward. That, incidentally, is why I voted for Trump. Not because I believed in some myth of him as a geopolitical genius, but because I knew that if you put a hollowed-out political corpse like Biden in the chair, surrounded by lawyers and bureaucrats like Sullivan and Blinken who have zero understanding of military and industrial realities, you dramatically increase the risk of nuclear miscalculation. These people were desperate enough, ignorant enough, and arrogant enough to push the world toward the brink without even understanding the fires they were playing with. Now we know who Trump really is: erratic, narcissistic, easily misled, but at least there appears to be a small group in his circle that understands the true ramifications of a war with Russia. That group knows that when the missiles start flying, there is no safe room for their families. Their sons, daughters, wives, parents are in the blast radius like everyone else, and some of them would prefer to avoid that outcome. That basic survival instinct was often missing in the Biden team. Meanwhile, people like John Bolton pontificate about forcing Ukraine to accept or reject an unacceptable peace as if the West has infinite options. There is an actual belief in many Western capitals, not just rhetoric, genuine belief, that they can choose to win this war whenever they decide to get serious. As if the only missing ingredient is political will, and once they find it, Russia will simply fold or be compelled to accept Western terms. It's delusional. From a strictly military point of view, there is nothing, I repeat, nothing in the Western toolkit today that could change the strategic calculus in Moscow without crossing into nuclear use. There is no magical combination of tanks, missiles, and brigades that suddenly flips the balance. Russia has the advantage in artillery, air defense, missiles, electronic warfare, and local manpower. It has the interior lines, the industrial base, the logistics tailored to this theater, and the doctrinal experience to exploit them. The problem is that most Western decision makers have no real military experience, no combat background, no deep operational understanding. They believe they can fly like Superman. They can put on the cape, climb onto the roof, jump, and maybe they'll discover gravity really does apply. But until that moment, the illusion is very comfortable. These people have a belief system, not a toolkit. They talk about sending U.S. divisions into Ukraine, a 4th Infantry Division here, a 2nd Division there, as if they'd be participating in some controlled exercise. In reality, under current conditions, those formations would be chewed up by Russian long-range fires and drones before they even reach their assembly areas. The U.S. military has no viable air defense to protect its forward columns against the kind of drone and missile saturation Russia can bring to bear, and no air superiority to compensate for that. What's the alternative? Escalate toward nuclear war. That's the dead end they never quite say out loud. So the West keeps flapping its lips about choices and forcing peace, and in reality there is no choice, there is no path to victory. There is only a path to more dead Ukrainians, a broken Europe, and a humiliated United States. Now, let me shift to the doctrinal and training reality, because that's where the gap between East and West is most visible. There was a recent report, even the BBC managed to describe it honestly, about a training exercise involving Ukrainian recruits and NATO forces, including Czech paratroopers. They were running a simple scenario: armored personnel carriers crossing a river and assaulting defensive positions. Classic NATO-style combined arms drill. What happened? The Ukrainians, playing defense, simply launched their Mavic drones. They immediately detected the advancing columns. The Czech commander running the assault side quickly discovered that every time his troops started moving in standard formation, the drones saw them and they were killed in the exercise. So he paused and asked the Ukrainians if they could turn off their drones. His excuse? You find us too fast with your Mavics and we can't get to you. You detect us on the approach to your positions. And think about what that reveals. NATO instructors are still mentally living in a world where you can form attack columns, march through a security zone, and only make contact near the forward line. They want to rehearse textbook attacks with neat formations, smoke, and synchronized movements as if there are no eyes in the sky. When confronted with the basic tactical reality of modern war, cheap drones providing constant reconnaissance and correcting fire, they ask to remove the drones from the scenario. In other words, please turn off reality so we can practice our fantasy. Henry Dodd. This is not a new problem. In 2002, during the Millennium Challenge war game, General Paul Van Riper, playing the Red Force, completely destroyed the high-tech Blue Force using asymmetric tactics and realistic employment of fires and deception. He sank the U.S. fleet, paralyzed their command and control, and revealed how vulnerable the doctrine really was. What did the Pentagon do? They reset the exercise. They literally gave extra lives to the Blue Force and changed the rules so that Red couldn't use tactics that worked too well. Van Riper walked away in disgust. That mindset rigged the game to protect the theory never really went away. I've heard similar stories from American officers who served in high-level staff exercises. They'd run a scenario where U.S. light infantry or airborne units go up against a Russian tank army. The result is obvious: slaughter. Next morning, the White Cell announces that all losses are magically replenished, units are back to 100% strength, and the plan continues. It's a cartoon. On the Ukrainian side, reality has bitten much harder. After the catastrophic 2023 counteroffensive, even Ukrainian officers told Western media that they had to discard much of the NATO training. One of them said bluntly, "If we had fought the way the Americans trained us, we'd be dead." They went back to their own manuals, Soviet-based doctrine adapted to current conditions, because marching Bradleys and Leopards in neat columns into layered Russian fire and drone coverage turned the steppe into a graveyard. Modern war on the Eastern Front is built around net-centric concepts, integrated reconnaissance strike complexes, 24/7 ISR, constant real-time data from satellites, drones, counter-battery radars, and ground sensors. The battlefield is observed every minute. You can't mass forces in a predictable axis without being seen, fixed, and struck. There was a recent example that illustrates this. A wounded Russian soldier with a badly injured leg was trying to get back to cover. He had a secure radio, and friendly drones were watching over him. The drone operators saw 2 Ukrainian soldiers moving to finish him off. They guided him via radio into a position behind them. Once the Ukrainians entered the building, he took them out. Then Russian medics came in under the drone's watchful eye and evacuated him. That's how modern war is fought: integrated sensing, communication, and fire, all the way down to platoon level. In this environment, the old NATO model of building battalion columns, forming them into company columns, forming company columns into neat assault groupings, and advancing them through an approach march is suicide. If you try that against a peer enemy with mature ISR and fires, you get a replay of the Bradley graveyard, burned out armored vehicles littering the fields. From the Russian perspective, territory is secondary. The primary objective is to destroy the enemy's military potential. Taking ground is a necessary evil, done to force the enemy to fight and die, and then later judged politically as liberation or annexation, depending on the outcome. Right now, Russia is steadily pushing what remains of the Ukrainian army back toward the borders of the 4 new regions it has incorporated. Lugansk is fully under Russian control. Donetsk is close to being secured in full. The rest is a question of time and attrition. What's truly shocking is that, despite the bloody lessons of 2023, Western training establishments are still teaching Ukrainians and their own troops doctrines that the battlefield has already shredded. The painfully learned lessons have not been integrated. They're still trying to train people to fight as if it were 1991 or even 1944. While Russia is fighting in 2024, if you look at U.S. doctrinal publications, FM 3 to 0 and the rest, they read like something written for a computer game. Lots of arrows, phases, and doctrinal buzzwords. But where in those manuals do you see a serious treatment of long-range fires under full ISR, of how to deploy and disperse a brigade so it isn't vaporized in its assembly area, of how to survive in a battle space where every movement is visible to drones and satellites? It's mostly missing. The documents assume away the core problem. Part of the reason is historical. After World War II, the US and NATO allowed German generals, Manstein, Hauser, and others, to shape much of the alliance's operational thinking. They wrote the histories, they wrote the manuals, they sold a myth of the Wehrmacht as an unbeatable tactical machine undone only by overwhelming numbers. They downplayed Soviet operational art and industrial power and caricatured the Red Army as human wave assaults. Those distortions were convenient during the Cold War and very flattering to Western egos, but they were poison for real understanding. Only a handful of Western historians and officers, like David Glantz and Jonathan House, did serious professional work on the Soviet and Russian way of war. Even then, their conclusions were often watered down or ignored by war colleges and general staff courses that preferred German memoirs and romantic myths. In Britain, the situation is even worse. Too many popular historians pushing political narratives instead of hard military analysis. So you end up with a Western officer corps whose intellectual DNA is shaped by a defeated German army's self-justifying stories, not by a sober study of the forces that actually broke the Wehrmacht and later built the 21st century Russian army. You end up with doctrine designed for a world that doesn't exist being applied against an adversary that has been studying you, your logistics, and your weaknesses for decades. Can cultural DNA be changed? In theory, yes. In practice, it usually takes a catastrophic defeat on home soil to shock a system into reform. Nobody sane wants to see the United States suffer that kind of disaster on its own territory. But short of that, the institutional resistance to reality is enormous. Officers who see and articulate the truth are rarely allowed near the levers of power. They're sidelined, retired, or ignored. The system protects its own myths. That's why, from where I sit, the outcome for the collective West is pretty clear. It's a bad end. The war is effectively over in strategic terms. Only the dying and the denial continue. Russia has won the military contest. Europe has been deindustrialized and tethered to expensive U.S. energy. The U.S. has exposed its doctrinal and industrial weakness. And yet, Western elites continue to posture as if they can reverse the tide by sheer willpower. What makes it truly agonizing is knowing that this stubborn refusal to face reality means more people will die for nothing. More young Ukrainians fed into the meat grinder, more economic pain for ordinary Europeans, more risk of miscalculation and escalation. The so-called great European leaders show almost no concern for the human cost of their policies. They are indifferent and in some cases psychopathic in their detachment from consequences. They'll talk about values and democracy while consigning an entire generation of Ukrainians to the grave and pushing their own societies into decline. My position is simple. Russia is not the villain here. Russia tried in December 2021 to put its core concerns on the table in a formal statement. That document spelled out the root causes: NATO expansion, missile basing, the militarization of Ukraine. Address those issues, Moscow said, and there will be no war. Nobody in the West took it seriously. They dismissed it, mocked it, or lied about it. So the war came exactly as warned. Now, the same people who ignored that warning insist they can still dictate terms. They can't. The only real choice left to the West is whether to admit reality sooner, with fewer dead, or later, with many more. Russia will not submit. Russia will not accept Western fantasies. Russia will fight until its objectives are achieved. And in this contest, given the balance of forces, Russia is going to prevail.